She had warned him. That was the part that stayed with Garrick Ashbourne long after everything else had happened, that Mabel Winslow had handed him every reason to walk away, and he hadn't taken a single one. She wrote it plainly in her last letter from Ohio. I am not the woman men choose when they have better options. I am large, I am plain, and I have spent my whole life watching men decide I am not worth the trouble. Standing on that frozen platform in Harwick, Wyoming, wind cutting through his coat, Garrick read those words a third time. He folded the letter. He stayed. And when the train finally groaned to a stop and a woman stepped down onto the ice-slicked boards with two battered suitcases and the expression of someone expecting to be turned away, he simply walked toward her, took the heavier bag from her hand, and said, "You must be tired. Let's get you home." What neither of them understood yet was that one quiet moment of decency was about to shake an entire town to its foundation. If this story moves something in you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The train was 40 minutes late, which gave Garrick Ashbourne plenty of time to regret his choices. He stood at the far end of the Harwick platform, away from the handful of other men waiting on goods or relatives, and he turned Mabel's last letter over in his gloved hands without opening it again. He'd already memorized it. That was the problem. The words had a way of playing themselves back at inconvenient moments. While he was checking fence line, while he was tallying feed costs, while he was lying in the enormous empty house at night listening to the wind work itself under the eaves. I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. He'd gotten 6 letters from Mabel Winslow over the past 3 months, after responding to her advertisement in an Ohio newspaper that a friend had left behind at the ranch house. He hadn't meant to respond. He'd picked up the paper to use for kindling, read the advertisement by accident, and then sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours before he put pen to paper. He wasn't entirely sure what had compelled him. The advertisement was written differently than the others he'd half-heartedly read over the years. No talk of beauty, no promises of domesticity, no careful performance of femininity designed to attract a wealthy husband. Mabel Winslow had simply written, "Practical woman, 31, Ohio." No illusions about what frontier life requires. Seeking honest arrangement with man who values competence over appearance. I will work as hard as you need me to. I ask only for fair treatment in return. He had written back, she had written back. And then they had written back and forth until the letters stopped feeling like negotiations and started feeling like something he'd been doing his whole life. Then the last letter came. There was something I should have told you earlier, and I kept putting it off because I was afraid you would stop writing. That was cowardly of me, and I'm sorry for it. I am a large woman, Garrick. I do not mean simply that I carry some extra weight. I mean that my size has been remarked upon, laughed at, and used against me for most of my adult life. Men who claimed to care for me changed their minds when they had to be seen with me publicly. I came to understand fairly young that there is a type of woman the world considers acceptable, and I am not her. I have made my peace with most of it, but I want you to make your decision with clear eyes. If you write back and tell me to stay in Ohio, I will understand completely, and I will not think worse of you for it. If you tell me to come, I will come, and I will give you everything I said I would, but I will not arrive on your platform and watch your face fall. I have survived a great many things, but I do not think I could survive that particular humiliation twice. Garrick had written back 2 sentences. Come to Wyoming, Mabel. I'll be the one on the platform. He hadn't told anyone in Harwick the full contents of her letter. He'd mentioned to Rosa, his housekeeper, that his intended was traveling from Ohio and would be arriving Tuesday. Rosa had nodded and started preparing the East Room, which was all he'd needed her to do. The train whistle announced itself before the engine appeared, a long, low sound that rolled across the flat land and echoed off the station house wall. Garrick put the letter in his coat pocket and straightened up. He was not a man given to nerves, generally. He was 51 years old. He had built Ashbourne Ranch from 200 scrubby acres into one of the largest cattle operations in the county, and he had outlasted a bad marriage and a worse drought and a fever that had taken his foreman and 2 hired hands in the same winter. He was not accustomed to standing on platforms feeling uncertain. He felt uncertain now. The train slid to a stop with a great exhalation of steam, and the handful of passengers who disembarked did so in the way that people do after long travel, slowly, carefully, blinking at the cold like it had personally offended them. Garrick watched the door of each car. He almost missed her. She came down the steps of the third car with her attention on her footing, both hands occupied with the handles of two mismatched suitcases, and she didn't look up until she'd reached the platform boards. Then she did, and she saw him watching, and for just a moment her expression did something complicated. Not quite fear, not quite resignation, something in between, braced for impact. Mabel Winslow was, as she had written, a large woman. She had dark hair pulled back under a gray wool hat and a coat that had seen better winters, and she was standing very still in the way that people stand when they are preparing to take bad news on their feet. Garrick walked toward her. He took the heavier suitcase from her right hand. "You must be tired," he said. "Long trip from Ohio." She stared at him for a moment like she was waiting for the other part of the sentence, the part where he made an excuse, or softened his expression, or found somewhere else to look. "2 days on the train," she said carefully. "Cold here. Colder than it looks." He picked up both suitcases. "My wagon's just around the front. Rosa's got something on the stove." Mabel followed him. She didn't say much else until they'd cleared the platform and reached the street, and then she said quietly, "You read my letter." "I read all your letters." "The last one." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And this is still—" "I said I'd be on the platform," Garrick said. "I was on the platform." She didn't answer that, but when he glanced over at her, something in her face had shifted. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long they've stopped noticing it, and has just now, for a fraction of a second, set it down. Cool. They were back on the main road out of Harwick before he realized they had an audience. He hadn't thought about it, which, in retrospect, was its own kind of naivety. Harwick was a town of roughly 1,200 people, which meant it was exactly large enough to sustain real commerce and exactly small enough for everyone to know the county's wealthiest rancher was collecting a mail-order bride off the Tuesday train. 3 women outside the dry goods store watched the wagon pass with the focused attention of people who had cleared their afternoon for precisely this purpose. Ed Calloway from the feed supply lifted a hand in greeting to Garrick and then let his gaze travel to Mabel with an expression that didn't bother disguising itself. Mabel noticed. Garrick could see it in the small tightening around her eyes, the way she kept her attention fixed on the road ahead. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't sure what he would have said that wouldn't have made it worse. The ranch was 5 miles out of town, and by the time they turned down the private road, the flat winter light was going gold and thin. The house came into view across the open ground. Not a homesteader's cabin, not a rough-hewn frontier claim, but a proper house. 2 stories, with a covered porch and glass windows and a barn that was larger than most people's main buildings. Garrick had built it over 12 years, adding to it as the ranch grew. And he'd never once stood in front of it and thought about whether it was impressive. It was just where he lived. Mabel looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "It's big," she finally said. "Just me living in it," he said. "And Rosa. Rosa is your housekeeper. She's been here 18 years. She'll be straightforward with you. That's not rudeness. That's just her." "I like straightforward." "Good," he said. "Then you'll get along." Rosa was, in fact, waiting on the porch, because Rosa was always where she was supposed to be before you expected her. She was a compact woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and the careful economy of movement that came from a lifetime of maintaining large households. She looked at Mabel for exactly as long as she needed to form an opinion, and then she said, "Come inside before the cold gets in. Soup's been on since noon." "Thank you," Mabel said. "I'm Mabel." "I know who you are," Rosa said, not unkindly. "Leave your coat on the hook. I'll show you the room." But the east room was small, but it had a proper window and a quilt on the bed that Garrick recognized as one Rosa had made herself, which he understood was a form of approval. Mabel set her second suitcase down inside the door and stood in the middle of the room, and Garrick set the heavier case beside it and stepped back. "It's your room," he said, "for as long as you want it to be. The rest of the house, the kitchen, the sitting room, any of it, use whatever you need. You don't have to ask." She looked at him steadily. "This arrangement," she said, "you said in your letters that you needed help running the household, managing accounts, that you weren't looking for—" She paused. "You weren't looking for something romantic." "I said I wasn't going to demand it," he said. "That's different." What does that mean? He thought about it for a moment. It means I'm not going to pretend I don't hope things go well between us, but I'm also not going to make you feel like you owe me anything for the train ticket. You came here to work. You can work. Everything else is up to you. Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in about 5 years. I told you in my letters I wasn't much for pretending. You did." She let out a breath. "All right. What time does work start?" He almost smiled. "After breakfast. Rosa will fight you if you try to take over her kitchen. Fair warning." "I'm not here to take over anyone's kitchen," Mabel said. "I'm here to make myself useful." He left her to unpack. In the hallway, he passed Rosa, who was carrying a small basin of warm water toward the east room door, and she gave him a look he had no idea how to interpret. "She's tired," Rosa said, which was not what she was actually saying. "I know." "Don't hover." "I'm not hovering." "You're standing in the hallway outside her room holding your own hat." He looked down. He was, in fact, holding his hat. He had no memory of taking it off. "Go check the horses," Rosa said. "She'll still be here in the morning." Then she was. Garrett came downstairs at 6 to find Mabel already at the kitchen table with the household ledger open in front of her, and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She was frowning at a column of numbers with the focused displeasure of someone who has found an error and is not going to let it go until she understands it. "Morning," he said. "Your feed costs from September are off," she said without looking up. "Either someone recorded a purchase twice, or you overpaid Callaway by $14. Garrick stopped. "You've been up since—" "I don't sleep well on first nights in new places." She looked up then. "Is it all right that I looked at the books? I should have asked. I'm sorry, It's fine," he said. That's why you're here. I wanted to understand what I was working with." She turned the ledger slightly so he could see. "The household accounts are organized, but the ranch accounts are a mess. Someone, you probably, has been doing everything by memory and just writing it down whenever you remember. That works until it doesn't." He poured himself coffee. "Are you always like this in the morning?" She considered this. "Pretty much. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's just going to take some getting used to." Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the open ledger on the table, looked at Mabel, looked at the coffee going cold, and went to put the eggs on without a word. But she was moving with a slightly different energy than she had the night before, and Garrick had known Rosa long enough to know that was not an accident. Mabel caught his expression. "What?" "Rosa made the quilt on your bed herself," he said. "She doesn't do that for everyone." Mabel looked at Rosa's back. Then she looked at the ledger again. "The September entry," she said quietly. "Can you check your receipt from Callaway? I want to know if I'm right." He went and checked. She was right. By the end of the first week, the ranch account books were in better order than they had been in 3 years. By the end of the second, Mabel had reorganized the supply pantry, created a proper inventory system, and identified 2 vendor arrangements that Garrick had been overpaying out of sheer habit. She did all of it without fanfare and without asking for acknowledgement, which meant Garrick found himself noticing things in the way you notice things when no one is performing for you. The particular concentration she brought to any problem that interested her, the way she talked to the ranch hands without condescension, the fact that she was always slightly ahead of whatever task she was supposed to be doing. The hired men liked her, which surprised him more than it should have, not in the demonstrative way of men trying to impress a woman, but in the way of people who have recognized that someone isn't going to waste their time. His foreman, a taciturn man named Dale Perkins, actually complimented her scheduling of the winter feed rotation, which Garrick was fairly certain was the longest conversation Dale had initiated with anyone in 4 years. Harwick was a different story. He drove Mabel to town the second Saturday after her arrival for supplies, and it was immediately clear that the town had spent the preceding 2 weeks forming its opinions. There was nothing overtly cruel, not in front of Garrick at any rate, but the looks were not subtle. Constance Hale, who ran the dry goods with her husband and who was the closest thing Harwick had to a social authority, smiled with the precise warmth of someone doing it for an audience. "You must be Mr. Ashbourne's friend," she said, with a pause that was not about finding the right word. "I'm his partner," Mabel said. "In the household. Clear even, not defensive." Constance smiled wider. Of course. We were all so curious when we heard Garrick had sent for someone from Ohio. Another pause. We just couldn't imagine what type of woman would suit him. The useful kind, I would think, Mabel said. Same as anyone. On the walk back to the wagon, Mabel's spine was very straight and her jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Garrick put the feed sacks in the back. She does that to everyone, he said. Does she? It wasn't a question. She tried it on Dale once. He stared at her for so long without speaking that she eventually just apologized and walked away. Despite herself, Mabel's mouth twitched. How long? He said afterward it was about 30 seconds. It felt longer. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, They expected someone different when you sent for someone. He didn't insult her by pretending he didn't understand what she meant. Maybe, he said, probably. A younger woman, prettier by whatever standard they use. The standard they use mostly has to do with what the Hale family approves of, he said. I've been in this county 30 years and I've never once managed to give them what they wanted. I'm not planning to start. She looked at him then, and he couldn't quite read the expression, something between gratitude and caution, like she was not entirely certain she believed what he was saying and also was not entirely certain she doubted it. I can hold my own, she said. I know that. I'm not telling you because I need reassurance. I'm telling you so you know I'm not going to run. I know that too, he said. Now get in the wagon before we both freeze. Astem. The whispers, when they reached Mabel's second hand, as they inevitably did, because whispers always find their way, were not creative. She was too large. She was not what the county's most successful rancher deserved. There was some talk, relayed to her by Rosa with characteristic bluntness, that a number of Harwick's leading families were personally affronted on Garrick's behalf, as though his decision to send for Mabel represented some failure of standards they felt ownership over. They said that? Mabel asked. They were in the kitchen, Rosa rolling pastry and Mabel entering the November figures into the newly organized ledger. More or less, Rosa said. I'm telling you because you'll hear it anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from someone on your side. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Are you? On my side. Rosa looked at her directly. I have worked for Garrick Ashbourne for 18 years. I have watched 4 women pursue him because of this ranch, and 0 of them stay because of him. You, she said, returning to her pastry, asked him about September's feed ledger before you'd finished your first cup of coffee. That's not exactly a declaration of loyalty. No, Rosa said. It's better than that. It's the reason. Mabel looked out the kitchen window at the winter fields, at the flat land running straight to the horizon. The old humiliation was there. It was always there, somewhere underneath things. The accumulated memory of men who had decided she was not worth the visible cost of choosing her. She had thought back in Ohio that she'd built a reasonable peace with it. She was starting to understand that peace and numbness were not the same thing, and she had been confusing them for years. She picked up her pen. Rosa, she said, what do you know about the County Harvest Fair? Rosa looked up from her pastry. Why? Because I heard it's been losing money 3 years running, and they can't find anyone to organize the kitchen properly. She wrote a figure in the ledger. I want to know who to talk to about it. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You're not going to hide in this house, are you? No, Mabel said. I don't think I am. Rosa went back to her rolling, but the corner of her mouth moved just slightly in a direction that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough. Outside, the winter light went gray and wide over the Ashbourne land, and somewhere in the main barn, Garrick Ashbourne was checking on the horses and thinking about a letter he'd read on a frozen platform, and a woman at his kitchen table who had already found 4 accounting errors he hadn't known existed. He didn't know yet what was coming. Neither did Harwick. The man who ran the Harvest Fair Committee was named Gerald Pruitt, and he was the kind of person who had held the same position for so long that he had started to mistake his title for his personality. Mabel found him at the county office on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after her conversation with Rosa, on a day cold enough that the frost hadn't left the window glass by mid-morning. She had written ahead, which she suspected he hadn't expected, and she arrived exactly on time, which she suspected he'd hoped she wouldn't. Gerald Pruitt was 60-something, with the carefully managed authority of a man who had spent decades making small decisions feel significant. And he looked at Mabel across his cluttered desk with an expression that was working hard to stay polite. "Mrs." he started. "Miss Winslow," she said, "though Garrick and I will be making the arrangement official in the spring. Either way, my name is Mabel." "Right." He shuffled some papers. "You said in your letter that you were interested in the kitchen operations. For the fair." "I did. We've had people volunteer to run the kitchen before, Miss Winslow. It's not a simple undertaking." "I know," she said. "That's why it's been losing money." Gerald blinked. 3 years, Mabel said. "Your kitchen operation has run at a deficit 3 years in a row. The 1883 fair lost $42 on food alone, which is a significant number when you consider that food should be one of your strongest revenue categories at an event like this." She set a folded piece of paper on his desk. "I pulled the public fair records. I hope that's all right." Gerald looked at the paper without picking it up. "Where did you—" "They're public records, filed at the county clerk's office." She folded her hands. "Your problem isn't the food itself. From what I can tell from the records, the volunteers know how to cook. The problem is procurement. You're paying full retail on almost everything because nobody's negotiating bulk pricing with suppliers in advance, and the scheduling is reactive. You're making decisions the day of the event instead of a month before it." Gerald Pruitt picked up her paper and read it. His expression moved through several stages she'd seen before. Skepticism, reluctant attention, and then the particular discomfort of a man who has just been shown he was wrong by someone he'd already decided not to take seriously. "The committee meets the first Tuesday of every month," he said finally. "I know, I'd like to come to the next one." Another pause. "The committee has members who've been part of this fair for 20 years. "I'm not asking to replace anyone," Mabel said. "I'm asking to fix the kitchen numbers. You can keep everything else exactly as it is." Gerald set the paper down. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look she recognized because she'd been on the receiving end of it her whole life, the look that was trying to find a reason to dismiss her that wasn't the obvious one. She held his gaze and waited. "First Tuesday," he said. 7 o'clock. "I'll be there," she said, and stood, and collected her coat, and left before he could change his mind. She didn't tell Garrick right away. That wasn't strategy exactly. She just hadn't decided yet how she felt about the whole thing. And she'd learned years ago that there was no point talking about something until you'd sorted out your own position on it. She told Rosa because Rosa had been the one to mention the fair in the first place, and Rosa listened with her arms crossed and her expression neutral, which was her version of rapt attention. "Gerald Pruitt," Rosa said when Mabel finished. "You know him." "Everyone knows him. He's been running the fair committee since before Garrick bought this land." Rosa uncrossed her arms and started on the dinner potatoes. "He once told a woman she couldn't volunteer for the booth rotation because she'd been married 3 times, and it set a bad example. What did she do? Ran the booth anyway. He didn't stop her because stopping her would have required him to say out loud why he was stopping her." Rosa cut a potato in half with more force than necessary. "He's not a bad man. He's a small one." "Small men can block things," Mabel said. "They can try," Rosa said. "You've got the numbers. Small men hate numbers because numbers don't care who's holding them." Mabel stood at the kitchen window and watched the last of the evening light go orange over the barn roof. She thought about the committee. 20-year members, established loyalties, the invisible infrastructure of a small town that had been running itself a particular way since before she arrived. She thought about the way Gerald Pruitt had looked at her across his desk, and the way the women outside the dry goods store had looked at her on that first Saturday, and the way Ed Calloway had looked at her from across the street, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was going to have to spend an exhausting amount of energy in this town simply being undeniable before anyone would hear a word she said. She had done it before. In Ohio, she had done it in a dress shop where the owner had hired her to keep books and then spent 4 months pretending the improvements in his accounts were his own ideas. She'd done it in the church hall where she'd organized the winter food drive for 3 years and received a certificate of appreciation addressed to someone named Mabel W., as though writing her full name might constitute an endorsement. The difference was that she had left Ohio. She was not leaving Wyoming. "Potatoes are almost done," Rosa said behind her. Go tell him dinner's ready. He's been in the study since 4 and he forgets to eat when he's doing accounts. Garrick was in fact in the study, and he had the look of a man who had been staring at the same column of figures long enough that they'd stopped making sense. He looked up when Mabel appeared in the doorway. "Rosa says dinner," she said. 2 minutes. "She said you'd say that. She also said to tell you 2 minutes means come now." He pushed back from the desk with the particular expression of a man who knows he's been managed and isn't entirely unhappy about it. He noticed, as he stood, that Mabel was still in her good coat, which she'd been wearing to town. "Where did you go this morning?" he asked. She'd figured this conversation was coming. "County office," she said. "I went to talk to Gerald Pruitt about the Harvest Fair kitchen." Garrick went very still in the way he sometimes did when he was deciding something. "Why?" "Because it's been losing money and nobody's fixing it." She met his eyes. "And because I need something to do that's outside this house. I need a reason to be in Harwick. Not just as whoever I am to you, as someone who does things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't own you, Mabel." "I know that. I mean," he stopped, tried again. "If you want to do something, you do it. I'm not going to tell you what's appropriate." "Your name will be attached to whatever I do," she said. "I figured you should know before the whole town does." He looked at her for a long moment, and she couldn't tell, as she often couldn't tell with him, what exactly was happening behind his eyes. He was not an easy man to read. He didn't perform his reactions for an audience, which meant that sometimes you had to wait longer than was comfortable to know where you actually stood. "Pruitt's not going to make it easy," he said finally. "He already tried not making it easy. I brought the numbers." A pause. "He let me come to the committee meeting." Something moved across Garrick's face then. Not quite a smile, but close enough to be its cousin. Of course he did. They went to dinner. The committee meeting on the first Tuesday of February was held in the back room of the county hall, a space that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and the particular mustiness of papers that had been stacked in the same corners for 20 years. There were 11 people around the table, and Mabel knew before she sat down that 7 of them had already made up their minds about her, and the other 4 were waiting to see which way the room moved. She had prepared for 3 hours the night before. She had a clean copy of the fair's food revenue figures for the past 4 years, a proposed supplier contact list with negotiated bulk pricing. She'd already confirmed in principle with 2 vendors, and a draft schedule for kitchen volunteer shifts that distributed labor more evenly than the current arrangement, which, as far as she could tell, relied on 3 women doing everything while 11 others got credit. Gerald Pruitt introduced her as a newcomer with some ideas about the kitchen, which was his version of faint praise, and the room regarded her with the politely guarded attention of people who have sat through many a newcomer with many an idea. She stood up. She put her figures on the table, and then she did the one thing she'd learned over years of being underestimated, that nobody ever expected her to do. She was specific, not vague helpful enthusiasm, not cheerful volunteerism, specific numbers, specific problems, specific solutions. The 1883 kitchen deficit broken down line by line, the procurement markup they were paying because nobody had called the suppliers in Cheyenne before the fair started. The scheduling gap that caused 3 overlapping volunteer shifts on Saturday and a complete absence of organized help on Sunday morning, which was when cleanup happened and when, apparently, everyone mysteriously had somewhere else to be. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the polite quiet of people being tolerant, a different kind. The working quiet of people who have just heard something they recognize as true and are doing the math in their own heads. A woman named Harriet Oakes, who had been running the pie section of the fair kitchen for 16 years and who had the look of someone who had been saying some of these same things for most of them, said, "The Sunday cleanup problem. You figured that out from the records?" "It's in the volunteer log," Mabel said. 11 people signed up for Saturday morning setup. 4 for Sunday breakdown. Same 4 every year. Harriet Oakes looked at Gerald Pruitt. Gerald Pruitt looked at his papers. "We've never had anyone go through the volunteer logs that way," said a younger man near the end of the table whose name Mabel hadn't caught. "I know," Mabel said. "That's part of why the problem's still there." It was not a comfortable meeting, exactly. There were 2 men, neither of them Gerald, though he didn't contradict them, who asked questions designed less to get information and more to establish that they were the ones asking questions. There was a moment when a woman named Cecilia Forsyth, who was married to one of the larger landowners in the county, said, with the careful sweetness of someone who has practiced this tone in mirrors, "It's so wonderful that you want to contribute, given that you haven't even been here a full season yet." And the room shifted in that way rooms shift when something unkind has been said out loud. Mabel looked at Cecilia Forsyth and said, "The numbers don't have a residency requirement." Harriet Oakes made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. Gerald Pruitt cleared his throat. "We'll take your proposal under consideration, Miss Winslow. We appreciate the preparation." "I'd like to be the one who implements it," Mabel said, "not just the one who suggests it." Another pause. Gerald looked at the room. The room looked back. "We'll discuss it," he said. She thanked him. She walked home in the cold, and her feet hurt from standing still for 2 hours, and her jaw ached from keeping her expression neutral during the Cecilia Forsyth moment, and she was not at all certain she'd won anything. But she had made the room quiet, and she had made Harriet Oakes say something, and those were not nothing. Besides, the letter from Ohio arrived on a Thursday in March. Mabel almost didn't open it immediately. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope as her cousin Ruth's, and Ruth wrote when she wanted something, which made the letter feel like a weight before she'd even touched the seal. She opened it at the kitchen table after dinner, with Rosa washing up at the basin and the lamp throwing yellow light across the page. Ruth's letter was 4 pages. The first 2 were social. The last 2 were the actual letter. Ruth wrote that people in the county back home were talking, that the story of Mabel going west as a mail-order bride had made the social rounds in a way that Ruth described as not entirely flattering, that there was a general sentiment among the women of their acquaintance, not cruel, Ruth emphasized, not cruel at all, that it was sad that Mabel had ended up having to go so far to find a man who'd have her, and that several people had remarked that it made sense, given that she'd always been the way she was. Mabel folded the letter. She sat with it for a moment. "Bad news?" Rosa asked, without turning from the basin. "Old news," Mabel said. "Just arriving late." She put the letter in her coat pocket. She didn't throw it away and she didn't read it again, which was its own kind of management. The thing about that kind of hurt, the kind that came from people who'd known you your whole life deciding you were a cautionary tale, was that it didn't announce itself. It settled. It found the places you'd already left vulnerable, and it sat there, very quiet, waiting to be believed. She had believed it for a long time. In her 20s, when a man named Thomas had courted her for 4 months and then stopped coming around after his family met her, she had believed it. When the dress shop owner had taken credit for her bookkeeping, she had believed it. When she'd written the advertisement and waited 6 weeks with no responses and told herself she'd known this would happen. She stopped that line of thinking. She was in Wyoming. She was running accounts for the largest ranch in the county. She was going to fix the Harvest Fair kitchen whether Gerald Pruitt liked it or not. The letter from Ruth was true about what people said. It was not true about what those things meant. The difference between those 2 things was, she was starting to think, the whole business. Gerald Pruitt came to the ranch on a Saturday morning in late March, which surprised everyone, including Rosa, who answered the door and then came to find Mabel in the study with the expression of someone reporting unusual weather. "Pruitt's at the door," she said. "Gerald Pruitt? Here?" "Apparently." He was standing in the front room with his hat in his hands when Mabel came downstairs, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and was now unhappy with the rehearsal. "Miss Winslow," he started, "the committee met Wednesday. We had a discussion." He paused. "Harriet Oakes talked for 20 minutes about the Sunday cleanup problem. She's apparently been raising it for 4 years. "I know," Mabel said. "She told me." He looked briefly pained. "We're giving you the kitchen." Another pause. "It's not a paid position." "I know that too." "And the committee will still have oversight on the—" "Gerald," she said, not unkindly. "I understand the conditions. I accept them." He turned his hat over once in his hands. He was not, she thought, a cruel man, just one who had been comfortable in his discomfort with her, and was now being asked to revise something he'd decided early. That was genuinely hard for people. She'd watched it happen enough times to know. The fair's in September, he said. That's 6 months. I know, it's enough. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left. Rosa appeared in the hallway the moment the door closed. Well, Rosa said. Well, Mabel agreed. 6 months was, as it turned out, almost exactly the right amount of time. It was enough time to contact every food supplier within 150 miles and negotiate terms that nobody on the committee had bothered to negotiate because nobody had ever written the letters. It was enough time to redesign the volunteer schedule into something that didn't punish reliability and reward avoidance. It was enough time for Harriet Oakes to become something close to an ally, and for 3 other fair committee members to quietly start asking Mabel questions they'd previously routed through Gerald. It was also enough time for Harwick to finish forming its opinion of her, which was mixed in the way that small-town opinions are always mixed. A complicated layering of the people who had decided she was a curiosity, the people who had decided she was an affront, and the people who were watching carefully to see what she actually did before deciding anything. Cecilia Forsyth's husband Owen made a comment at the cattlemen's meeting in April. Garrick told her about it because he felt she should know, and because he'd apparently responded in a way that ended the conversation, to the effect that it was a shame Garrick had settled when he could have done better. Owen Forsyth had framed this as concern. Most concerns of that variety were, "What did you say?" Mabel asked. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, the first evening warm enough to do so without coats, and the light was going purple and slow over the fields. "I told him I hadn't settled," Garrick said. "I told him the woman running my household had found 4 accounting errors in the first week and was about to turn the Harvest Fair kitchen from a money pit into a revenue operation, and that if he defined those qualities as settling, then we had different definitions of the word." Mabel looked at her hands. "You didn't have to defend me." "I wasn't defending you," he said. "I was telling him the truth. There's a difference." She didn't answer right away. The thing about Garrick Ashbourne was that he said things like that. Flat, clear statements that didn't ask for anything back, and she still wasn't entirely sure how to receive them without getting them tangled up in all the ways she'd learned over the years to doubt that kind of statement. She had been told she was valued before, by people who had meant it at the time and changed their minds later. She'd been told she was capable and good at things, and those statements had existed comfortably right up until the moment a man needed to choose between her and something easier. Garrick hadn't needed to choose yet. That was the honest part. "I'm going to do the fair right," she said, "whatever it costs. I know that. If it works, if the numbers come in the way I think they can, there are going to be people who take credit for it." "Probably Gerald," he said. "Probably, and that's fine. If the fair succeeds, the kitchen succeeds. That's what matters." He looked at her sideways. "Is it?" She thought about it honestly. "Mostly," she said. He made a sound that was very close to a laugh, which was rare enough that she noticed it. "Go to sleep," he said. "You've been up since 5. "So have you." "I'm used to it." "So am I," she said, and didn't move. And they sat on the porch for another half hour in the cooling dark, while the stars came out one by one over the Wyoming flats. And nobody said much of anything, and it was, in its quiet way, one of the better evenings she'd had in a long time. She wasn't sure when she'd started noticing that. She wasn't sure now that she could stop. By July, the Fair Kitchen volunteer list had 32 confirmed names, 8 of whom had never volunteered for anything in the fair's history. The supplier agreements were signed. The menu: 4 weeks of careful planning, 3 recipe tests, 2 shouting matches with Harriet Oakes about the pie schedule that ended both times with them agreeing on something better than either had originally proposed, was finalized. And then, 10 days before the fair, Cecilia Forsyth hosted a dinner party. Mabel wasn't invited. That was not the problem. She had no particular desire to spend an evening in Cecilia Forsyth's dining room. The problem was what reached her afterward, through Harriet Oakes, who'd been there and who arrived at the ranch the following morning with the specific expression of someone carrying information they'd rather not be carrying. She said it in front of 7 people, Harriet said. They were in the kitchen, Rosa conspicuously present at the counter. She said that whatever the Fair Kitchen produced this year would be a curiosity at best, and that everyone would be polite about it, but that nobody genuinely expected a woman like that. Harriet stopped. Those were her words. a woman like that. I know what she meant, Mabel said. The thing is, Harriet said carefully, two of the people there have daughters who've been volunteering in the kitchen this summer. And after Cecilia said that, one of them, Edna Marsh's daughter, Eleanor, apparently said, I think Mabel knows what she's doing. And Cecilia said, Harriet stopped again. What did she say? That Eleanor was sweet for being loyal to her, quote, charitable project. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Rosa set down the thing she was holding and turned around. She called you a charitable project, Rosa said. Not a question. To be fair, Mabel said, she probably believes it. That doesn't... I know. Mabel was quiet for a moment. She was doing the thing she did when something hit harder than she wanted to show, going very still, breathing evenly, finding the solid ground underneath the reaction. It's 10 days before the fair. There's nothing she can say right now that matters more than what happens at the fair. Rosa and Harriet exchanged a look. You're not going to let it get to you, Harriet said. It wasn't quite a question. Mabel looked up. Oh, it already got to me, she said. That's not the point. The point is what I do with the 10 days. She stood. Are the Delacroix brothers confirmed for the Saturday morning delivery? Harriet blinked at the shift. Yes. And Eleanor Marsh, is she still on the Sunday crew? As far as I know. Good. Tell her I said thank you. Mabel picked up her schedule from the table. I'm going to count the serving equipment. We're short 2 ladles, and I want to find that out now instead of the morning of. She walked into the back pantry and started counting ladles, and she was doing it with methodical attention, and her hands were completely steady, and nobody could see her face, which was fine. Some things didn't need witnesses. The ladles were found, both of them, at the back of a storage crate that someone had shoved behind the salting barrels sometime around 1881 and apparently never mentioned to anyone. Mabel added them to the inventory list, noted the crate location, and spent the rest of that evening reorganizing the pantry so that the same thing couldn't happen again with anything else. That was how she handled the 10 days before the fair. One task at a time, specific and countable, because specific and countable things could not be argued with and did not care about dinner party conversations. She confirmed the Delacroix brothers for Saturday morning. She walked the fairgrounds with Harriet Oakes on a Tuesday afternoon and marked out the kitchen tent positions with stakes, arguing mildly about the placement of the bread station until they found an arrangement that satisfied neither of them perfectly and both of them adequately, which Harriet said was the best outcome of any planning meeting she'd ever been part of. She ran a practice session with 12 volunteers on the Thursday before the fair, cooking a scaled-down version of the Saturday menu in the church hall, and discovered 2 timing problems and 1 ingredient substitution issue that would have caused real trouble on the actual day. She fixed them. She updated the schedule. Eleanor Marsh showed up to the practice session with her sleeves already rolled up and a look of focused readiness that reminded Mabel, uncomfortably and then warmly, of herself at 23. Eleanor was 18, the daughter of a decent family that wasn't particularly wealthy, and she had the quality that Mabel had learned to value above most others in a volunteer. She did what she said she would do, exactly when she said she'd do it, without needing to be asked twice. Your mother know you're here? Mabel asked her, not accusingly, just checking. She knows, Eleanor said. She said to tell you she's coming Saturday with her sisters and they're going to eat everything. Tell her I'll hold the apple preserves. Eleanor smiled and went to her station and got to work. The morning of the Harwick Harvest Fair arrived gray and cool, which was Wyoming's version of cooperative weather in September. The sky was the color of old tin and the air smelled of coming cold, but it wasn't raining. And after 6 months of preparation, Mabel had decided that not raining was all she was going to ask of the universe. She was at the fairgrounds by 4:30 in the morning. The Delacroix brothers arrived at 5 with the first delivery, 2 wagons loaded with the supplier goods she'd negotiated in the spring, at prices that were, she calculated, 31% below what the fair had paid in previous years. She checked every crate against her list. 1 barrel of flour came up short, which the older Delacroix brother, a man named Claude, who had approximately 4 words of English and an excellent memory for numbers, indicated with 2 fingers and a questioning look. Mabel found the discrepancy in the delivery receipt, pointed at it, and Claude shrugged with the expression of a man who had seen this problem before and knew how it ended, which was with him going back to get the rest of the flour. He went. Harriet Oakes appeared at 5:45 with 6 volunteers and a look on her face that meant she'd been awake since 4 and wasn't going to admit it. "How are we?" she asked. "Short 1 flour barrel, otherwise on schedule," Mabel said. "Start the bread prep. The yeast went in at 5. It should be ready." "Who's on the bread station?" "Margaret Voss and her daughter. They know what they're doing, just make sure they have enough counter space. Last time they were squeezed into a corner and the daughter burned her arm on the edge of the stove," Harriet said. "I remember. I've already moved the station." Mabel looked at her. "You're not the only one who noticed things for 20 years, Harriet said, not unkindly. "I just didn't have the paperwork to back it up." By 7 o'clock, there were 9 people working in the kitchen tent. And by 8, when the fair officially opened and the first visitors began filtering through the gates, there were 14, working in shifts that Mabel had arranged so that nobody was on their feet for more than 3 hours without a break, which was a change from previous years when the same exhausted women had been standing on the same exhausted feet from sunrise to close with no system and no relief, and the general understanding that this was simply how things were. Gerald Pruitt came by at 8:30 on what Mabel suspected was an inspection, though he'd have called it something else. He stood at the entrance of the kitchen tent and watched for a few minutes without speaking. The bread station was operating. The soup was on. The pie section, Harriet's domain, non-negotiable, had 3 varieties ready and a 4th in progress. There was no shouting, no confusion, no one standing in the middle of the space looking lost. "Looks organized," Gerald said. "It is organized," Mabel said. "Right." He looked at his watch. "First wave of real visitors around 10 usually." "I know. We'll be ready." He nodded and left. Mabel went back to the soup. Hotsem. The first wave came closer to 9:30, which was earlier than anyone had seen in the fair's recent history, and Mabel only found out later that word had reached some of the neighboring town visitors through channels she hadn't anticipated. Specifically, 2 of her volunteer suppliers had mentioned to their customers that the Harwick Fair was doing something different with the kitchen this year, and those customers had apparently mentioned it to other people. And so by 10 o'clock, there was a line outside the kitchen tent that wrapped past the livestock display and nearly reached the entrance gates. Harriet came to find her. "You need to see the front." Mabel came around the corner of the tent and saw the line and felt something that was not quite panic and not quite triumph. Something more like the sensation of standing at the edge of something much larger than you'd planned for and having to decide very quickly whether that was good or bad. "How are the pies holding?" she asked. 3 dozen gone already. Margaret's second bread batch just came out. Tell her to start the third. Don't wait for the second to run out." Mabel was already moving back inside. "Eleanor, take the serving table. Don't let anyone rush you. Set the pace yourself. If the line has to wait 2 minutes, it waits 2 minutes. Don't let them make you hurry and spill things." Eleanor nodded and went to the table with the focused calm of someone who had been told exactly the right thing. The next 4 hours were the most relentlessly physical work Mabel had done since arriving in Wyoming, and she had not by any measure been sitting idle since January. She was everywhere in the kitchen, not because she didn't trust the volunteers, but because the scale of what was happening had exceeded the plan, and plans only survived contact with reality if someone was watching where they were breaking down and fixing them in real time. The soup ran faster than projected. She'd budgeted for 300 servings, and they were at 200 by noon, so she pulled the reserve stock she'd had the foresight to set aside and started a second pot. The bread ran even faster than the soup. Margaret Voss's daughter, whose name was Clara, and who had said almost nothing during the practice session, turned out to be extraordinary under pressure. She managed the bread station with a quiet, focused authority that kept 3 other volunteers operating in the right order without anyone having to be told twice. "She's good," Harriet said to Mabel at one point, watching Clara redirect a volunteer with a gesture and 2 words. "I know," Mabel said. "I saw it at the practice." "You didn't say anything." "I wanted to see if it was real or just nerves." A pause. "It's real." The pie section sold out completely at 1:45 in the afternoon, which had never happened in the fair's history. Harriet came and told Mabel with an expression that was trying not to be stunned and not entirely succeeding. "What do we do?" Harriet asked. "Tell people we're sold out," Mabel said, politely, "and tell them when next year's fair is. They're going to be disappointed." "Disappointed people come back," Mabel said. Unsatisfied people don't. Harriet went to handle it. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron and took a half-minute to stand still, which was the closest she'd come to stopping all day, and looked at the kitchen tent from the inside. At the organized stations, the moving volunteers, the rhythm that it held because it had been built to hold, not just hoped into existence. It wasn't perfect. The soup had been thinner than she'd wanted in the second pot because the reserve stock was a different ratio. Clara had cut her finger on a bread knife around noon and kept working after a brief stop to wrap it, which Mabel had seen and worried about, and let go because Clara had clearly already decided she was fine. And stopping her would have been more about Mabel's anxiety than Clara's actual welfare. The coffee service had run 15 minutes behind for most of the morning because the person she'd assigned to it had a slower pace than the schedule assumed, and she'd had to quietly redirect another volunteer to help without making the first person feel managed. None of it had collapsed. All of it had bent without breaking, which was better than perfect and was, in fact, what she'd planned for. Not a flawless operation, but a resilient one. The man who introduced himself to Mabel at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was not from Harwick. He was from Cheyenne, he said, and his name was Arthur Fenn, and he had the groomed, deliberate look of a man who is accustomed to walking into rooms and being the most financially significant person present. He was maybe 55, with a good coat and a way of holding himself that communicated, without being rude about it, that his time was worth monitoring. "Someone told me to find the woman running the kitchen," he said. "That's me," Mabel said. She had a dish towel over her shoulder and flour on her left sleeve and was fairly sure she had soup on her boot, and she did not apologize for any of it. Arthur Fenn looked at her for a moment. Not the assessment she'd become accustomed to in Harwick, the kind that moved from her face to her figure to some internal ledger of adequate and inadequate, but a different kind, the kind that was actually trying to understand what it was looking at. "You planned this entire operation?" he asked. "Myself and several other people," she said. "Harriet Oakes managed the pie section. But the overall, the procurement, the scheduling?" "Yes." He looked around the tent. The line outside had never completely disappeared, even at 3 in the afternoon, which was 2 hours past when it should have thinned out based on any previous fair year. "I've been to 4 county fairs this season," he said. "I've been looking at the food operations at all of them." "Why?" "Because I'm looking to invest in restaurant ventures," he said. "And I keep finding that the best cooking talent in this territory isn't in restaurants. It's in church halls and fair kitchens and the back rooms of hotels." He paused. "This is the best-run food operation I've seen at a county fair in Wyoming, possibly in 3 states. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean practically?" "It means I'd like to discuss backing a restaurant. Your restaurant, specifically." He produced a card from his coat pocket. "I have partners in Cheyenne who would provide the capital. You would handle the concept and operations. We'd split the profits on terms that are, I'm told, generous." She looked at the card. "Arthur Fenn," it said, and a Cheyenne address, and a description of his business that involved investment and property development. "I appreciate you coming to find me," she said. "I'm going to need some time." "Of course." He glanced around the tent again. "One question, if you don't mind." "Go ahead." "How did you know the demand would be this high? You were clearly prepared for more than the previous year's numbers." Mabel thought about how to answer that honestly. "I wasn't entirely prepared," she said. "I had reserve stock and a flexible schedule. I made adjustments as the day went. That's not the same as knowing." He seemed to find this more interesting than a confident yes would have been. "That's a useful distinction," he said. "Most useful ones are," she said, and excused herself, because Clara's station needed attention and Arthur Fenn's card could wait in her apron pocket for a few hours. Garrick found her at close when the last of the kitchen volunteers had gone, and Mabel was walking through the tent doing the final inventory count, checking what had sold, what remained, what the numbers actually said against what she'd projected. The lanterns were the only light, and the fairgrounds outside were quiet, the particular quiet of a place that has held a large crowd and is now learning how to be empty again. He leaned against one of the tent poles and watched her move through the station counts without interrupting. He'd been at the fair most of the day. She'd seen him periodically, talking to other ranchers, watching from a distance, but they hadn't spoken more than a few words since early morning. "Well?" he said, when she reached the end of the last station and stood looking at her clipboard. She had to look at the numbers for another moment before she could answer, because she was doing the math in her head and wanted to do it right. "We're up," she said. "Over last year. Over any year in the record." She paused. "If I had to estimate, we generated somewhere between 3 and 4 times the kitchen revenue of 1883. I'll need to go through the receipts properly, but..." She stopped. "But what? I'm just making sure I'm reading this right." She looked up. "We sold out of everything, every item. Nothing is sitting. The only reason we have anything left in this tent is because it's equipment, not food." Garrick nodded slowly. He didn't say anything dramatic. That wasn't his way. "A man from Cheyenne talked to me," Mabel said. "Arthur Fenn. He wants to back a restaurant. Says he's been looking at food operations across 3 states. Something in Garrick's posture changed slightly. Not negatively, but with the attention of a man who has just heard something he needs to think about carefully. "What did you tell him?" "That I needed time." "Do you want to do it?" She put the clipboard down. This was the question, really. Not what Arthur Fenn was offering, not what Cheyenne could provide, but what she actually wanted, which was a question she'd been careful not to ask herself too directly because it had an answer she wasn't sure she was ready for. "I want to run a restaurant," she said. "I've wanted that for a long time, long before Wyoming." She met his eyes. "Fenn wants to put it in Cheyenne. His partners have a property there, apparently. Cheyenne's a good city for it." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the fairgrounds, 2 men were loading something heavy onto a wagon, the rhythm of it audible through the canvas. "What's the problem, then?" Garrick asked. "His terms," she said. "He described them as generous. I haven't seen the actual numbers yet." She paused. "And I don't know what I'd be giving up." He knew she wasn't talking about money. She watched him understand that, and she watched him decide, slowly and deliberately, how to respond to it. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said. "I want that said clearly." "Garrick, let me finish." He shifted against the tent pole, looking at the middle distance rather than at her, which was how he handled things that were costing him more than he wanted to show. "I'm not going to be the thing that keeps you from what you want. I said when you arrived that everything was up to you. That includes this." "What if I want you to have an opinion?" He looked at her then. "My opinion is that you could run a restaurant in any city in this territory, and it would be the best one there." "That's not opinion, actually. That's just what I saw today." A pause. "My other opinion is that Cheyenne is a long way from Harwick." "I know. And whatever this is, what we have, what we've been building, I don't know if it survives a long way from Harwick." The lantern nearest her flickered in a draft that came through the gap in the tent canvas, and for a moment the light went warm and unsteady, and she could see his face clearly. Not the controlled, careful face he showed most people, but the face underneath it, which was older and less certain and considerably more honest. "I haven't said yes to Fenn," she said. "I know. I'm saying I want to think about it properly. All of it." "That's reasonable." "You're being very calm about this." "I'm not particularly calm," he said. "I'm just trying not to say something I'd regret." She picked up her clipboard again. She didn't have anything else to write on it, but it gave her hand something to do. "Let me get through counting the receipts," she said. "Then I want to talk." "All right." "Not like this. Not in the tent." She looked around at the empty stations, the stacked equipment, the spent lanterns. "At home." He didn't react to the word. She wasn't sure she'd meant to use it. But there it was, sitting between them in the quiet, at home. And neither of them said anything about it, and she picked up the first receipt stack and started counting. The ride back to the ranch was quiet in the way their silences had become over the months. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but inhabited. The kind of quiet that meant both people were thinking and had decided the thinking was all right to do out loud. Mabel was running numbers in her head partially. The other part of her was doing something harder to measure. The accounting that had nothing to do with receipts, the ledger of the past 8 months that included the East Room and the frozen platform, and Ruth's letter and Cecilia Forsythe's dinner party, and the practice session where Eleanor Marsh had showed up with her sleeves already rolled, and the morning she'd found Garrick in the study at 6 a.m., eating cold breakfast because he'd been going over the winter feed plan since 4 and had simply forgotten to heat it. She had not written back to Ruth. She wasn't sure what she would have said. The things that mattered couldn't be summarized for someone who'd already decided how the story ended. When they got back to the ranch, the house was dark except for the kitchen lamp, which Rosa always left on. They came inside without speaking, and Mabel put her clipboard on the table and Garrick started the fire in the sitting room because the night had gotten cold, and by the time she'd washed her hands and face and come to sit down, there was enough warmth starting that she could take off her coat. "Fenn's offer," she said. "I'm going to look at the actual terms before I decide anything, but I want to tell you what I've been thinking." "All right," he said. He was still crouched by the fire, adding a piece of wood, and he didn't turn around. "I could go to Cheyenne," she said. "I could probably make it work. The money would likely be better than anything I could build here. And nobody in Cheyenne knows me as the fat mail-order bride from Ohio." She said it without venom, just as a fact, because it was what she'd been called and pretending otherwise didn't change it. "I could start completely over." He put the last piece of wood on and stood and turned around. But I keep thinking about what that is, actually. Starting over somewhere nobody knows me." She looked at the fire rather than at him. "I've been starting over my whole life. I started over when Thomas stopped coming around. I started over when the dress shop owner took the credit. I started over when I put that advertisement in the paper and moved to Wyoming." She paused. "At some point, starting over is just running." He sat down in the chair across from her. The fire was catching now, the light steadying. "What do you want instead?" he asked. "I want to build something," she said. "Not somewhere that doesn't know me. Somewhere that does know me and had to change its mind." She looked up at him then. "I want to open a restaurant in Harwick." He was very still. "I know it's a smaller market," she said. "I know the money won't be what Fenn's offering. I know there are people in this town who are not going to want to give me their business, at least not at first." She straightened. "But I fixed the fair kitchen and the numbers proved it out. And I am not going somewhere easier because Cecilia Forsythe made a comment at a dinner party." A pause. "I'm staying." The fire made a small sound, the wood settling. "Harwick doesn't have a proper restaurant," Garrick said. "I know. Nearest one is 20 miles. I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "I have capital," he said. "The ranch had a good year, and I've got reserves I've been sitting on because I hadn't found anything worth putting them into." He said this carefully, not as an offer being made strategically, but the way he said most things, directly, with the understanding that she would tell him if he was wrong. "I'm not Fenn. I don't have partners or a property portfolio, but I have enough to build something reasonable, and I'd rather be your partner than watch someone else be. That's a significant thing to offer," she said. "I know what it is. You'd be risking actual money." "Mabel." He said her name in the way he occasionally did. No flourish, just the name, with the weight of everything he wasn't elaborating on behind it. "I've been watching you fix things since January. I think my money's safe." She looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought about Arthur Fenn's card, which was still in her apron pocket, which was hanging by the door. She thought about Cheyenne and the clean start, and the version of herself that didn't carry Harwick's history. She thought about this sitting room and the kitchen with Rosa's pots on their hooks, and the east room that had become just her room, and the accounts she'd reorganized in January, and the ledger she'd built from the fair's receipts tonight that would show, in clean columns and accurate figures, exactly what she'd done, and that it was real, and no one could take it back. "I'll tell Fenn no in the morning," she said. "And then I want to talk about what we need for a building." Garrick nodded. He didn't say he was glad, which she appreciated, because gladness right now felt like pressure, and she had made this decision without pressure, and she wanted it to stay that way. "Get some sleep first," he said. "You've been on your feet since 4:30. "So have you." "I haven't been running a kitchen tent for 11 hours. "No," she said. "You've just been running a ranch." He almost smiled again. She was getting better at catching it, that almost smile, that barely there thing that lived in the corner of his expression when he was genuinely amused but couldn't quite justify the full version. She went to bed. She was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started, and she did not dream, and in the morning the receipts were still on the table and the number was still better than anything the Harwick Harvest Fair had ever done before. It was real. She had done it. And nobody, not Cecilia Forsythe, not Ruth in Ohio, not the accumulated weight of every man who had looked at her and found the math insufficient. Nobody could make it untrue. That was, she was starting to understand the whole point of doing the work. She wrote to Arthur Fenn the next morning before breakfast, while the house was still quiet, and the receipts from the fair were stacked on the corner of the table where she'd left them. She kept the letter short. She thanked him for his interest and his time, told him she had decided to pursue a different direction, and wished him well with his investment work. She did not explain herself at length, because lengthy explanations were what people wrote when they were still convincing themselves, and she had already done that work. She sealed the envelope and set it by the door for the post, and then made coffee and sat down with the fair receipts and did what she'd been too tired to do the night before. The full accounting, every line, every category, cross-referenced against her projected figures. The final number was better than she'd estimated in the tent. The kitchen operation had generated 4 times the revenue of the previous year. Net of the supply costs she'd negotiated, the fair would clear more from food sales alone than it had made in total from its last 3 years combined. She went through the math twice because numbers that surprised her deserved the courtesy of being checked, and the second time came out the same as the first. She was looking at this when Garrick came downstairs. He stopped when he saw her expression. "Good number or bad number?" he asked. She turned the paper so he could see it. He looked at it for a long moment. "That's the net figure?" "After all costs." He sat down. He read the number again. "Gerald Pruitt is going to have a complicated morning," he said. "Gerald Pruitt is going to have to stand at a committee meeting and report results that are 4 times anything his fair has ever produced," Mabel said. "Which he'll do, and he'll be slightly uncomfortable doing it, and then he'll move on to the next item on the agenda." "You're not going to make him say your name in the report?" "I'm going to be at the committee meeting," she said. "That's enough." Garrick looked at her with the steady attention he gave to things he was reassessing. "You let a lot go," he said. The Forsyth comment. The Pruitt introduction. "Your cousin's letter." "I don't let it go," she said. "I just decide where I'm going to spend my energy." She poured herself coffee. "The fair is done. Now I want to talk about the restaurant." He nodded. That was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. The absence of preamble when there was work to be done. He didn't need to finish the emotional conversation before he could move to the practical one. He could hold both at the same time, which was rarer in a person than it should have been. "There's a building on Crane Street," he said. "Corner lot. It's been empty 2 years. The man who owned it went back east after his wife died, and he hasn't done anything with it since. I know the property agent. The bones are sound. You've already been thinking about the building." "I've been thinking about it since March," he said. "When you went to see Pruitt." She set her cup down. "March. You told me you needed something outside the house. I started paying attention to what was available." He said this without self-congratulation, just stating a sequence of events. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't mine to decide, but I wanted to know what was there if you decided." She thought about that for a moment. About March, and the county office, and the committee meeting, and all the months between then and the fair, and Garrick going about his days knowing about a building on Crane Street and not once mentioning it because it wasn't his to mention. "Can we go look at it today?" she asked. "I'll send word to the property agent this morning." The building on Crane Street was, as Garrick had said, sound in its bones and catastrophic in its current condition. The previous owner had run a dry goods operation on the ground floor and lived in the rooms above, and the intervening 2 years of vacancy had given the Wyoming winters considerable opportunity to make their opinions known. The front window was intact but fogged with grime. The interior smelled of must and old wood, and something that Rosa, who had insisted on coming, diagnosed as a previous rodent situation that had resolved itself naturally. "They're gone," Rosa said, after a thorough examination of the corners. "Probably a year ago." "How do you know?" Mabel asked. "Because I've been maintaining houses for 40 years, and I know what gone looks like." The layout was better than Mabel had expected. The ground floor was larger than it appeared from outside. A long main room with good ceiling height, a back area that had been used for storage but had the right dimensions for a kitchen, and a side door that opened onto the alley, which was exactly where she needed a service entrance. The floors were warped in 2 places, and one section near the back wall had soft spots that would need replacing, but the structure around them was solid. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, measuring it with her eyes. "What are you seeing?" Garrick asked. He was leaning against the door frame watching her. 12 tables, she said. Maybe 14 if I use the corner space. The kitchen needs to be rebuilt almost entirely. The current setup won't work for real service volume. She walked to the back. I need a range that can handle 4 pots at once minimum, and I need the prep area separated from the cooking area. Right now there's no separation. She came back to the center. The front window needs to be replaced. The floors need work. The walls need... She stopped, looking up at a water stain on the ceiling. That's been fixed, the property agent said from the doorway. He was a nervous man named Clifford, who had arrived at the building slightly out of breath and had been taking careful notes. The roof was repaired 18 months ago. The previous owner did that before he left. The water stain is old. I'd want that in writing, Mabel said. Of course, Clifford said, writing something down. Rosa was examining the back kitchen area with the focused displeasure of someone who has cooked in inadequate spaces for decades and has personal feelings about it. The ventilation is wrong, she said. If you're running a range that size in here with no proper ventilation, you'll smoke out your customers before October. I know, Mabel said. That's a rebuild. A real rebuild, not a patch. I know, Rosa. Rosa made a sound that indicated she was not sure Mabel fully appreciated the ventilation situation, but was willing to let it go temporarily. They spent 2 hours in the building. Mabel took measurements, made notes, identified every problem she could find, and 2 she was fairly certain existed behind the walls. When they came out onto Crane Street and Clifford gave her the asking price, she looked at Garrick. He looked back. Negotiable? She asked Clifford. Everything is negotiable, Clifford said carefully, within reason. She made a counteroffer. Clifford went pale, recovered, and said he'd have to speak with the owner. She said she'd wait to hear back by Wednesday. Clifford wrote this down and left. Garrick watched him go. You went in at 60% of asking, he said. He'll come back at 80. We'll settle at 70, maybe 72. She looked at the building. The repairs are going to cost more than the building is worth at full price. He needs to reflect that, or we're absorbing costs that belong in the negotiation. Rosa, standing behind them both, made a different sound, one that Mabel had learned to identify as approval, which Rosa kept carefully disguised at all times, so as not to overuse it. Clifford came back Tuesday, not Wednesday, at 75%. They settled at 71 after a 20-minute conversation that Mabel handled while Garrick sat in the property office and said almost nothing, which she'd asked him to do because Clifford kept looking at Garrick for confirmation of her positions, and she wanted it established, from the beginning, whose restaurant this was. When the paperwork was signed, the building on Crane Street belonged to them jointly. That had been Garrick's suggestion and her agreement, made in the sitting room at the ranch the week before, in a conversation that was practical on the surface and something else entirely underneath. I want it in both names, he'd said. It's your capital. Our arrangement has a legal component that we've been informal about, he said. When we formalize it in the spring, joint property makes sense, but I don't want to wait until spring to put the building in both names. A pause. If something happened to me, I want there to be no question about what's yours. She'd looked at him across the kitchen table. Nothing is going to happen to you. Probably not. I'd still like to do it this way. She thought about it for a moment, the practical weight of it, and the other weight, the one that didn't have clean columns. All right, she said. They'd shaken hands, which had made Rosa, who was standing at the counter, apparently doing something with a pot, make a sound that neither of them acknowledged. The renovation took 11 weeks, which was 4 weeks longer than Mabel had planned, and 2 weeks shorter than the builder she hired had estimated. The builder was a man named Hutchins, who had a crew of 4, and the slow, relentless competence of someone who had been doing careful work for 30 years and was not going to be hurried out of it. He and Mabel argued about the kitchen ventilation design for the better part of a week before arriving at a solution that satisfied her airflow requirements and his structural concerns, which involved cutting a section of the roof she hadn't budgeted to touch. She added it to the numbers and moved on. She was at the building most days, not to supervise Hutchins. He didn't need supervision, which she'd established in the first week, and then deliberately stepped back from, but because she needed to understand every part of what was being built. She needed to know where the pipes ran, and where the floor supports were, and which wall was load-bearing, not for any immediate practical reason, but because she had learned, over the years, that knowledge of the structure you were working in was the difference between being prepared and just hoping. Eleanor Marsh started coming by on afternoons, initially to help with the painting of the back room, which she'd offered to do and which Mabel had accepted because Eleanor worked the way she worked, focused, steady, without the performance of effort. They talked while they painted, conversations that drifted from the practical to the personal and back again in the way of people who are discovering they have more in common than the immediate task. "Are you going to stay in Harwick?" Eleanor asked one afternoon. She was doing the far wall and she asked the question with her back turned, which gave it a casual quality that didn't entirely match the careful way she'd phrased it. "I live here," Mabel said. "Some people thought you'd go to Cheyenne after the fair." Eleanor kept painting. "Someone told my mother there was a man from Cheyenne who offered to set you up there." "There was." "But you didn't." "No." A pause. "Why not?" Mabel thought about this. Not the answer she'd given Garrick in the sitting room, which was true, but whether it was the whole truth or just the part of it she could say clearly. "Because leaving somewhere you haven't finished yet isn't a fresh start," she said finally. "It's just leaving." Eleanor turned around. She was 18 and she had the particular intensity of someone who is still close enough to the age where every decision feels like it determines the rest of your life. "My father wants me to go to his sister in Denver," she said. "He thinks there are more opportunities there." "There probably are." "But?" "I didn't say but." "Your voice did." Mabel set down her brush. "I think opportunities are real wherever you make yourself useful," she said. "Denver or Harwick, the question is whether you're going somewhere or leaving something." She picked the brush back up. "Those look similar from the outside and they're completely different." Eleanor turned back to her wall. She was quiet for a while, then, "I want to work here, in the restaurant, when it opens." "I know," Mabel said. "I was going to ask you." The painting continued. The walls came together slowly, stroke by stroke, the way every real thing does. The renovation was finished on a Thursday in December, and the first time Mabel walked through the completed space without Hutchins' crew in it. She brought only Rosa. Garrick had offered to come. She'd asked him for an hour alone with it first, and he'd understood, because he understood most things she didn't fully explain, which was one of the qualities she'd stopped taking for granted somewhere around August. The kitchen was better than she'd planned. Hutchins had done something with the east wall that gave her more prep counter space than the original design, a small adjustment he'd made without mentioning it. And then, when she'd noticed and asked about it, explained in 3 sentences before moving to the next thing. The ventilation was correct. She could feel the draw of the air even with the range cold, which meant it would work properly when it was hot and full of steam and the Saturday dinner service was at its worst. The floor in the main room was new pine, pale and even, not yet marked by any of the things that would eventually mark it. Rosa walked slowly through the kitchen, opening the cabinet doors, testing the counter surface, checking the fire distance on the range. "Well," Mabel said. "It's a proper kitchen," Rosa said. This was the highest endorsement available from Rosa's vocabulary, and both of them knew it. "The ventilation is right." Rosa closed the last cabinet. "You argued with Hutchins for a week about it. He was wrong initially. And then you were both right." Rosa looked around one more time. "This is a real kitchen, Mabel, not a fair tent, not a church hall." She said it without sentiment, just the plain fact of it. "You built this." "We built this. You told me about the fair. Eleanor painted half the back room. Harriet Oakes is already planning what she wants to bring to the opening." "Harriet is going to try to install herself as the pie authority," Rosa said. "She is the pie authority. I have no interest in competing with Harriet on pie." Mabel ran her hand along the prep counter. "I'm going to ask her to handle the baking on a paid basis. Real wages, not volunteer." Rosa looked at her. "She'll say yes." "I know. I want to ask properly anyway." They stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, not talking. Outside, the December cold pressed against the new windows, and the light through the front glass was the thin, flat light of a Wyoming winter afternoon, and the room smelled of fresh pine and new paint, and the particular potential of empty spaces that haven't had their history made yet. "You should go get Garrick," Rosa said finally. "He's been standing outside in the cold for 40 minutes. I told him an hour. He came early. He's been on the boardwalk since before we got here." Rosa picked up her coat. Go get him, boss. He was, in fact, on the boardwalk, leaning against the post with his hands in his coat pockets, and an expression that communicated nothing useful about how long he'd been there. The sky had gone gray and heavy with the look of coming snow. You could have come in, Mabel said. You asked for an hour. It's been 40 minutes. Close enough. He looked at the building. How is it? Come see. She brought him through the front and walked him through every room the way she'd been walked through things she cared about, pointing out the specific choices and the reasons for them, the ventilation design and the counter space and the floor and the thing Hutchins had done with the east wall. Garrick listened the way he always listened, which was fully, without the restlessness of someone waiting for their turn to speak. When they got to the main room and he'd seen all of it, he stood in the center and looked around with the same slow, taking it in attention she'd given it an hour earlier. Tables go where? He asked. She pointed out the arrangement she'd planned. 12 tables, 15 if the corner space worked as she hoped. She walked him through where the service path would run, the sight lines from the kitchen door, the way the light would move through the front window in the morning versus the evening. He asked 2 questions, both practical, and she answered them, and then he was quiet for a moment. Ashbourne Kitchen, he said. It was the name they'd discussed. His name, her work. She'd pushed back on it once, and he'd pointed out, with characteristic directness, that the ranch was called Ashbourne, and they were going to be married, and the name would be hers too. And they could call it something else if she wanted, but he thought it sounded right. She had thought about it for a day and decided he was correct, which she'd told him the way she told him most things. Without ceremony, in the kitchen, while doing something else. Ashbourne Kitchen, she confirmed. He looked at her then, not at the room. You know the town is going to have opinions. The town always has opinions. Some of them are going to come in hoping you fail. And they're going to eat the food anyway, she said, because there's nothing else within 20 miles. She said it without bitterness, just the plainness of it. And when they come in hoping I fail and the food is good, one of 3 things happens. They come back. They don't come back, but they stop hoping I fail because it's too much effort. Or they keep hoping I fail and come back anyway because the food is better than their feelings about me. She paused. All 3 of those outcomes work. He was quiet for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved. Not the almost smile, the actual one, which she had only seen 4 or 5 times since January, and which was, each time, startling in its completeness. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I've had a lot of evenings on the porch to think. So have I, he said. He wasn't smiling anymore, but the expression that replaced it was something she'd also come to recognize. The direct, undefended look he had when he was about to say something that cost him something. I have not been good at telling you what this year has meant to me. I know that. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. He looked at the pine floor for a moment. I've been running that ranch for 30 years, and I stopped believing a long time ago that it was going to feel like anything but work. That's not self-pity. It's just, I made my peace with it. He looked up. You came off that train in January, and inside a week the books were in order, and inside a month the ranch hands were following a schedule they actually liked. And by April, Dale Perkins, who has not initiated a conversation since 2019, since before I can remember, was voluntarily explaining your feed rotation to a man from the neighboring property. A pause. And now there's a restaurant. Our restaurant, she'd said. Our restaurant, he said. The snow that had been threatening all afternoon started then, the first few flakes coming in slow and almost deliberate against the front window, the way Wyoming snow began, not rushed, as if it had somewhere specific to be. I think we should open in February, Mabel said. He looked at the window. February's cold. People eat more in cold weather. Fair point. I need 6 weeks to source the opening menu properly, and I want to train Eleanor and the kitchen crew in the actual space before we open to the public. Not a church hall practice, in this kitchen, with this equipment. She was already thinking forward, running the schedule in her head. I want to do 1 or 2 invitation dinners first. People we know. Let the kitchen crew find their rhythm before we have strangers in here. Rosa, he said. Rosa will hate being called a guest. Rosa will hate being called staff more. Rosa's situation is complicated, and I have a conversation to have with her that I haven't had yet. She paused. She's been at the ranch 18 years. I can't just assume she wants to upend her entire work life because I'm opening a restaurant. She's already reorganized her schedule to be free on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Garrick said. Mabel looked at him. I didn't tell her to, he said. She just did it. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Of course she did. She turned back to the room. The snow was coming more steadily now, and the light had shifted to the particular blue-gray of a late Wyoming afternoon in winter. She thought about the past year, the frozen platform, the east room, the ledger in the morning, the ladles in the storage crate, the fair tent at close with the last lanterns burning, Arthur Fenn's card in her apron pocket, the building on Crane Street. She thought about Ruth's letter, which she still hadn't answered. She thought about Thomas and the dress shop and the advertisement in the paper and all the places she had been before this one, and she thought, not for the first time but with more clarity than she'd had before, that the difference between where she'd been and where she was had very little to do with geography. I want to write to Ruth, she said. My cousin. She wrote to me in March. Garrick had heard about the letter. What are you going to tell her? I'm going to tell her I'm opening a restaurant in Wyoming, Mabel said, and that I'm getting married in the spring, and that she's welcome to visit if she'd like to see it. She paused. I'm not going to explain anything else. She can draw her own conclusions. That's generous, he said neutrally. It's not, actually, she said. I just don't have the energy to be unkind to Ruth. She's not a bad person. She's just someone who decided what my life was going to be and wrote to tell me she was right. She looked at the snow against the window. She wasn't right. Garrick didn't say anything, which was sometimes his best response. Let's go home, Mabel said. Rosa's going to have dinner on, and she'll be annoyed if we're late. She'll be annoyed regardless. Then let's be late for a reason. I want to walk. He looked at her. In the snow. It's just starting. We have 20 minutes before it's actually snowing. She picked up her coat from the peg by the door. I want to walk through town. I want to see the building from the outside with the new window. She stopped, slightly self-conscious. That's probably... Put your coat on, he said. I'll walk. They went out into the Crane Street cold, and she turned to look at the building, and the new front window caught the last of the afternoon light and the first of the falling snow, and it looked like a place where something real was going to happen. She stood there for a moment, just looking. He stood beside her, also looking, without asking her what she was thinking, which was correct. She wasn't ready to say it yet. The exact shape of what she felt standing on the sidewalk in December, looking at something she had built, in a town that had underestimated her, beside a man who had not. She was going to need some time to find the right words for that. She had time. She was staying. They walked home through the beginning of the snow, and the street was quiet. And Harwick was the same as it always was, neither kind nor cruel in any final way, just a town with its habits and its history and its slow, grudging capacity to be changed by the people who refused to leave it. Mabel Winslow walked through it without hurrying. She would be here in the morning, and the morning after that. That was in the end the whole answer. Ashbourne Kitchen opened on a Tuesday in February, which was not the most logical day for a restaurant to open, but was the day Mabel had decided on because she'd been ready since Monday, and she was not going to wait one more day simply for the convention of it. The invitation dinners had happened the 2 Saturdays prior. Small gatherings, 15 people each time, people she and Garrick knew and trusted enough to hear honest feedback from rather than polite encouragement. Rosa had come to both, and had spent most of the first one in the kitchen doorway watching the crew work with the expression of someone conducting a silent audit. By the end of the second dinner, she had taken off her guest coat, put on an apron, and begun quietly managing the dessert timing, which nobody had asked her to do and which nobody attempted to stop. She can't help it, Eleanor said afterward, washing up. I know, Mabel said. I'm going to pay her properly starting next week. Does she know that? She will on Monday. Rosa, when told on Monday morning at the ranch kitchen table, said that she didn't need to be paid for something she was going to do anyway, which was her version of yes. The feedback from the invitation dinners had been specific and useful. One table said the lamb was under-seasoned, which Mabel agreed with and had already adjusted. Another said the bread service was too slow between the first course and the main, which was a kitchen timing issue she'd worked through with Eleanor and Clara Voss until it stopped being an issue. Clara had come on as the bread and baking lead, a title Mabel had invented specifically because Clara needed a title, Not because titles meant much to Mabel, but because Clara was 20 years old and had been excellent, and excellent people deserved to know you'd noticed. By the time the doors opened Tuesday morning, the kitchen had run the full menu 6 times. It was not flawless. Nothing that had been run 6 times rather than 60 was flawless. But it was ready, which was different. The first week was harder than she'd expected and better than she'd feared. The hard part was volume. She'd projected conservatively. This was Harwick, not Cheyenne, and it was February, and she had not wanted to be caught with staff she couldn't justify. What she hadn't fully accounted for was the fair. The Harvest Fair had become, in the months since September, a kind of shared reference point in the county, a thing that had happened that people mentioned to each other. The way people mentioned the specific occasion when they first understood something was going to be different. The kitchen at the fair had done what it had done, and the numbers had made their way through Harwick in the way numbers do in small towns. And by the time Ashbourne Kitchen opened its doors, there were people who had been waiting. By Thursday of the first week, she had turned away 8 parties she couldn't seat, which was a problem that felt strange to have. She sat down Thursday evening with Eleanor and Clara and the schedule and worked out how to absorb more covers without running the kitchen past what it could produce consistently. Because inconsistency was the thing she was most afraid of. A restaurant that was extraordinary twice and mediocre the third time was a rumor waiting to happen. "We can do 2 more tables," Clara said, looking at the floor plan Mabel had drawn on the back of an order sheet. "If we move the corner arrangement by 4 feet. The service path gets tighter. I know, but I've been watching Eleanor navigate it all week and she's fine." Eleanor, who was present, said nothing, which was her way of confirming that she was fine. 2 tables, Mabel said. "We add them Saturday and see how the flow works." It worked. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The Forsyths came on a Friday evening in March. Mabel knew they'd come eventually. Cecilia Forsythe was not the type to avoid a place simply because she'd said unkind things about its founder. She was the type to arrive and behave as though the unkind things had been said by someone else. Owen Forsythe followed his wife in most social decisions the way a boat follows a current, without much independent navigation. Eleanor was at the door when they arrived, and she came to find Mabel in the kitchen with the expression of someone delivering information neutrally on principle. "Forsyths," Eleanor said. "Table 4, Mabel said, without looking up from the sauce she was monitoring. "Give them the good seats. The window side." Eleanor paused. "You want to give them the window side?" "I want them to have a good experience," Mabel said. "The window side is the best seat in the room. Give it to them." She didn't go out to the dining room until the kitchen had a natural pause, which was about 40 minutes into the Forsyths' meal, and then she went out not to speak to them specifically, but to check the room generally, as she did twice an evening. She moved from table to table, asking the usual questions, listening to what people didn't say as much as what they did. When she reached table 4, Cecilia Forsythe looked up with the careful composure of someone who had also been waiting for this moment and had prepared for it. "Miss Winslow," Cecilia said, "the food is excellent." "I'm glad," Mabel said. "Is there anything I can bring you?" A pause. Cecilia had the look of someone who had expected a different kind of conversation and was recalibrating. "No," she said. "No, everything is fine." Owen Forsythe said the lamb was the best he'd had in Wyoming, which he delivered with the slightly surprised emphasis of a man who hadn't expected to be saying it. Mabel thanked him, checked on the adjacent table, and went back to the kitchen. Eleanor materialized at her elbow within 60 seconds. "Well?" "She said the food was excellent," Mabel said. "That's all?" "That's all I needed." She picked up the next order. "Table 7 needs more bread." Eleanor went for the bread. Mabel returned to the range. She was not going to pretend the moment hadn't mattered. It had mattered. Not in a triumphant way, not in the way she might have imagined it mattering back in March, when Harriet Oakes had reported the dinner party comment. It mattered in a quieter way, the way things matter when they resolve without drama. When the person who said you were a charitable project is sitting in the best seat in your dining room telling you the food is excellent, and you are too busy running a real business to feel much more than a mild, steady satisfaction about it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a very specific and underrated kind of victory. In April, 2 things happened within the same week. The first was that Harriet Oakes, who had been managing the baking for Ashbourne Kitchen since the invitation dinners, and whose pies had become a specific reason people made the trip from neighboring towns, told Mabel she wanted to formalize the arrangement. She didn't mean a contract. She meant that she wanted it understood publicly that she was part of this operation. She said it plainly, standing in the back kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon with flour on her hands and the particular look of a woman who has been waiting a long time to ask for something she deserved. "You've been part of this operation since September," Mabel said. "I thought that was already understood." "I want it said," Harriet said. "Out loud. In the arrangement." Mabel extended her hand. "Harriet Oakes, you are the head of baking at Ashbourne Kitchen. Your name goes on the menu." Harriet looked at the extended hand for a moment. Then she shook it. "On the menu," she said as if verifying. "Under the desserts section. Pastry by Harriet Oakes." Mabel said it clearly. "You've earned that." Harriet did not cry, because Harriet was not a person who cried in kitchens. But something moved across her face that was in the general territory of it. She went back to her pie crust and said nothing else, and Mabel updated the printed menu the following morning before she could put it off. The second thing that happened that week was the train. Mabel was at the restaurant on a Thursday afternoon working through the supplier orders for May when Eleanor came in from outside with the look she had when she'd seen something and was deciding how much to make of it. "There was a woman on the noon train," Eleanor said. "I saw her when I was coming back from the post." "All right," Mabel said, not looking up. She had 2 bags. She was standing on the platform for a long time after everyone else had left. A pause. She looked, I don't know, she had the look of someone waiting to be told to go back. Mabel looked up then. "She's still there?" she asked. "I don't know, maybe. It's been about 20 minutes. Mabel set down her pen. She put on her coat, which was hanging by the back door, and she walked to the train station, which was 6 blocks from Crane Street, and it was a cold April afternoon with the wind off the flats doing what Wyoming wind did when it was making a point. The woman was still on the platform. She was younger than Mabel, mid-20s maybe, with a round, soft face and the particular way of standing that Mabel recognized from a train platform 14 months ago. Not quite frozen, not quite moving. Balanced exactly at the moment between arrival and the decision about whether arrival had been a mistake. She had 2 bags, as Eleanor had said. One of them was nicer than the other. She was heavy-set in the way that had, at some point in her life, been explained to her as a problem, and she had the residual posture of someone who had heard that explanation often enough to start carrying it in her shoulders. "Are you waiting for someone?" Mabel asked. The woman looked at her. Yes. No." She stopped. "I'm supposed to meet a man named Harris Colby. We've been corresponding. He said he'd be here." Mabel looked around the platform. It was empty except for a station master inside the glass and a dog of uncertain ownership sleeping against the far wall. "You might be running late," Mabel said. "The clock in Harwick runs about 8 minutes fast. Everyone knows except visitors." The woman looked at her with the expression of someone who isn't sure if they're being helped or managed. "Is that true?" "About the clock, yes. About Mr. Colby, I honestly don't know." Mabel paused. "Do you have somewhere to wait while you find out?" There's a hotel in town, I was told." "There is. It's on Mill Street, about 4 blocks. Mabel looked at the bags. "I'll carry one if you want. I'm going that direction anyway." The woman stared at her. "You don't have to." "I know that," Mabel said, and picked up the heavier of the 2 bags. "I'm Mabel Ashbourne. I run the restaurant on Crane Street." A pause, during which the woman processed several things at once. "Margaret Hale," she said. "From Indiana. Long trip. 2 days. Cold here. Colder than it looks," Mabel said, and started walking. And after a moment, Margaret Hale picked up her remaining bag and followed. They walked 4 blocks in the April wind, and Mabel didn't ask questions Margaret hadn't indicated she wanted to answer, and Margaret didn't volunteer things she wasn't ready to say, and it was in its way a perfectly calibrated silence for 2 women who were still working out the geography of the situation. At the hotel door, Mabel set the bag down. "The restaurant is on Crane Street," she said. "If you need a meal or somewhere to sit for a while, we're open from 11. Margaret Hale looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has braced for a particular kind of arrival and received a different one. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she'd intended. You'll be all right, Mabel said. Not a promise. She didn't know this woman, and she didn't know Harris Colby, and she was not in the business of making promises about other people's lives. She said it the way you say the true version of it, which is not prediction, but something closer to a decision. One way or another. She walked back to the restaurant. Harris Colby turned up the next morning with an excuse about a delayed supply run that may or may not have been true, and Margaret Hale moved into the arrangements that had been made for her, and the particular story of those two people continued in its own direction, which was not Mabel's story to tell. What Mabel knew was that Margaret Hale came to Ashbourne Kitchen 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when the lunch service had wound down and the room was half empty and quiet. She came alone and she sat at a table near the window and ordered coffee and the bread service. And she sat there for a long time. Eleanor brought her things and left her alone, which was the correct instinct. Mabel came out after the kitchen was settled and sat down across from her, uninvited, which she recognized was a liberty. Margaret Hale looked up without surprise, which meant she'd been expecting it. "How are you finding it?" Mabel asked. "Harwick?" Margaret looked out the window. "Cold. Everyone looks at me. They look at everyone new. They look at me differently." She said it without self-pity, just the flatness of someone stating a known condition. "I know what kind of looking it is." "Yes," Mabel said. "So do I." Margaret looked at her then, and something shifted in the calculation behind her eyes. "You do, don't you?" "I got off this train 14 months ago," Mabel said, "with 2 bags, one nicer than the other." A pause. Outside, someone drove a wagon down Crane Street with the particular indifference of a person who has somewhere to be. Margaret watched it pass. "Does it get better?" Mabel thought about this seriously, because the question deserved seriousness and not comfort. "The looking doesn't stop entirely," she said. "But it changes. When you do enough things, eventually people have to look at those instead." She paused. "That takes longer than it should, and it's unfair that it has to work that way. But it does work that way if you stay." "What if the man—" Margaret stopped, started again. "What if Mr. Colby—" "I don't know Mr. Colby," Mabel said. "I can't tell you about him." "I know. I wasn't asking about him exactly." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "I was asking, what if it doesn't work out the way I hoped? What do I do then?" "The same thing you'd do if it did work out," Mabel said. "You figure out what you're useful at and you make yourself useful. You find the people worth finding." She looked around the room, at the tables Hutchins had built with the right spacing, at the window that caught the afternoon light in the way she'd wanted it to, at Eleanor refilling a coffee cup at a table near the door with the easy competence of someone who had found her place. Everything else is a result of that. It doesn't come before it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Did you know that when you came here? That it would work out?" "No," Mabel said. "I knew I wasn't going back." The two things, not knowing and not going back, sat between them in the quiet of the Sunday afternoon, and Margaret Hale looked out the window at Harwick with a slightly different expression than she'd had when she came in. "I can cook," Margaret said. "I'm good at it." Mabel looked at her. "What kind?" "Preserves mostly, jams, my mother's recipes. I know 12 varieties." Mabel thought about the menu. She thought about the supply costs for the condiment and preserve section, which she'd been buying from a distributor in Cheyenne because there was nothing local. She thought about Harriet's name on the menu under the dessert section, and Clara's title, and Eleanor's steady presence at the door. "Come in Tuesday morning," she said. 8 o'clock. "Bring whatever recipe you're most confident in, and we'll see what we're working with." Margaret stared at her. "I haven't asked for a job." "I know. I'm asking if you want one." Mabel stood. "Tuesday at 8. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and there's no harm done. If it does, you'll have something that belongs to you here, and that matters more than people think it does when they first arrive." She went back to the kitchen and left Margaret Hale at the window table, which was the best seat in the room when the afternoon light came through it, and which Mabel had learned from Cecilia Forsythe's evening and a dozen other evenings since, was worth giving to the people who needed it. Margaret came Tuesday. The preserves were extraordinary, a plum variety with a sharpness that cut through sweetness at exactly the right moment, and an apple-ginger combination that Rosa, when she tasted it without knowing the context, said was the best she'd had since a woman in Santa Fe 30 years prior. Mabel put Margaret on a trial arrangement and told her the terms plainly, the way she'd learned to say things, not performing generosity, not underselling what she was offering, just the truth of the exchange laid out, so both people could see it. By the end of April, Margaret Hale's preserves were on the menu. Her name was not on it yet. There was a conversation still to be had about that, about whether Margaret wanted that visibility or was still deciding whether she was staying. Mabel didn't push. She'd learned over 14 months, and in the process of becoming someone different than who she'd been when she arrived, that there was a particular kind of help that looked like help and was actually pressure, and there was a different kind that looked like patience and was actually respect. The second kind was harder to give and worth considerably more. Harris Colby, for his part, turned out to be a decent man with limited imagination, which was not the worst thing a person could be. He was not unkind to Margaret. He was also not, by April, entirely certain what he'd sent for when he'd sent for her, because Margaret was not the arrangement he'd imagined, and she was increasingly clear about the fact that she had her own direction. How their particular story resolved itself was something that happened over time, and not without difficulty, and was, ultimately, theirs to work out. What Mabel could say, because she watched it from close enough to see, was that Margaret Hale arrived in Harwick frightened and left her first month of it less frightened than she'd started, and that the Tuesday mornings in the Ashbourne kitchen back room had something to do with that, and the Sunday afternoon at the window table had something to do with it, and the name that eventually went on the menu under the preserves had something to do with it too. The spring wedding was small, because Mabel had planned it the way she planned everything, for what it was rather than what it was supposed to look like. They married on a Wednesday morning in the county clerk's office, with Rosa and Harriet Oakes and Dale Perkins as witnesses. Dale had not, to anyone's knowledge, served as a witness at anything before, and he appeared to take the responsibility with the same taciturn seriousness he brought to the winter feed rotation. Harriet brought a small cake, because she was constitutionally incapable of attending any occasion without bringing something baked, and Rosa wore a hat that Mabel had never seen before, and which had clearly been purchased specifically for the occasion, and which Rosa would deny, if asked, had any particular significance. Garrick wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and the expression of a man who had made a decision he was entirely at peace with, which was, in Mabel's experience of him, the only kind of decision he made. She signed the papers with her own hand in the new name, Mabel Ashbourne, and felt the way names feel when they fit. Not like a new garment, but like the right one, finally. Afterward, they walked back to the restaurant because there was a lunch service, and you didn't close the restaurant for your own wedding if you'd built the restaurant to be the kind of place that people counted on being open. Rosa handled the kitchen lead for the service, which she did with the authority of someone who had been doing this for 18 years in various configurations, and was not impressed by the formality of the title. Eleanor managed the room. Everything ran. Mabel and Garrick ate at table 4. The window table, the good seats. And it was the first time she'd sat in the dining room during service rather than moving through it, and it was strange to be still while the room worked around her, and she decided, watching Eleanor and Clara and the kitchen door swinging open and closed in its rhythm, that strange was all right. Strange meant something had changed. "It's good," Garrick said about the lamb. "I know. I adjusted the seasoning in January. I know you adjusted it. I'm still allowed to say it's good." She looked at him across the table. He had the particular expression he had in good moments, not the almost smile, the real one, quiet and resident and not asking for anything back. "It's good," she agreed. "We did something good here." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way he did things that mattered, without announcement, without asking to be noticed for it. Then he picked up his fork and went back to his meal, and she did the same, and the lunch service continued around them, and outside on Crane Street, Harwick went about its Thursday the way it always did, changed and not changed, the way places are when the people in them have shifted something that can't be unshifted. A year after the fair, Mabel Ashbourne stood in the back kitchen of Ashbourne Kitchen at 6 in the morning, before anyone else arrived, doing the thing she did every morning, walking the stations, checking the prep, reading the day's order list against the supply inventory, finding the three things that needed attention before service and addressing them before the crew arrived so that the crew could arrive to a kitchen that was ready rather than one that was catching up. She had been doing this for 11 months. She would do it tomorrow and the day after that. She was not who she'd been when she'd stepped off that train. Some of the change was visible. She carried herself differently, stood differently in rooms, spoke first in conversations where she once would have waited to be addressed. Some of the change was interior and harder to describe, the kind that happened in the accumulation of mornings like this one, ordinary and specific. The knowledge built one day at a time that you were capable of the thing you were doing. She thought sometimes about Thomas from Ohio and the dress shop owner and Ruth's letter. She thought about them without anger, mostly, which had taken longer than she'd have liked to arrive at. The anger had been real, and it had been earned, and she did not begrudge herself the time it had taken to put it down. She'd put it down eventually, not because she'd forgiven anyone particularly, but because carrying it was work she was no longer willing to do, and she had better work. She thought about what it had cost her to come here. The advertisement in the paper, the weeks of waiting, the letter she'd written to a stranger explaining the precise nature of her disqualifications. She thought about the particular courage, not dramatic courage, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet, grinding kind, required to board that train not knowing what waited at the other end of it, knowing that the most likely outcome was a man's face falling and an arrangement dissolved, and the long trip home carrying the confirmation of every voice that had told her she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. That courage had not felt like courage at the time. It had felt like running out of options. She supposed, standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning with the day's orders in her hand, that most real courage felt like that, like the absence of better choices rather than the presence of special qualities, like stubbornness more than bravery, perseverance more than heroism. She was not a hero. She was a woman who had been tired of the life she had and had been willing to risk the life she didn't know, and that willingness, ordinary and impure and not even entirely voluntary, had been enough. She thought it was worth saying, if only to herself in the morning kitchen. It had been enough. The ordinary willingness to show up and stay and do the work. Not gifts, not beauty, not the characteristics that the world around her had spent considerable energy suggesting were the requirements for a life that meant something. Just the work. Just the staying. She heard Eleanor's key in the back door at 6:15, which was early. Eleanor was always early, and had given up pretending otherwise. She came in with her coat still on and her hair not entirely settled, and she stopped when she saw Mabel at the station and said, "You were here before me again." "I live 10 minutes closer." "That's not why." Eleanor took off her coat. "It's never why." Mabel set down the order list. "Range needs lighting. Bread flour is in the left bin today. I moved it because the right bin has a gap in the seal I want Hutchins to look at before we use it." She picked up her apron. "The Delacroix brothers are coming at 7 with the weekly delivery. If I'm not out front, you receive it." "I know how to receive a delivery," Eleanor said. "I know you do." A pause. "You're very good at this, Eleanor." Eleanor stilled. In the year she'd worked at Ashbourne Kitchen, she had been corrected, redirected, scheduled, thanked in the practical way, and given a title and a raise at 3 months and another at 9. She had not often been told plainly that she was good at the work. "Thank you," she said carefully. "You should know it," Mabel said. "It's important to know what you're good at when you're building something. It's harder to do it in the dark." Eleanor nodded. She went to the bread station and began her morning prep, and the kitchen began its first movements of the day, and Mabel lit the range and felt the warmth of it come up slowly, the way warmth always does, gradually, and then all at once, until you can't remember how the space felt before it was there. Outside, Harwick was waking up. The street sounds came through the building's walls in the way she knew now. The particular creak of the door at the hardware store. The delivery wagon that always ran early on Fridays. The sound of the wind that was never entirely absent in Wyoming, that had been the first sound she'd heard on the platform 14 months ago, and that she'd stopped noticing somewhere around March because she'd stopped waiting to leave. Garrick would be at the ranch, already out in the fields with Dale, doing the work that the ranch required and that he did with the same quiet, unglamorous competence she'd recognized in him from the first week. The quality that had made her trust him before she had any framework for trusting anyone in Wyoming. He would come by the restaurant at noon, as he did most days, and sit at the counter with coffee while she moved between the kitchen and the room. And they would talk in the shorthand they'd developed over a year of building something together, and then he'd go back to the ranch, and she'd go back to the service, and the ordinary day of their life together would continue. It was not a spectacular life. She wanted to be honest about that. There were difficult weeks and disagreements and days when the kitchen ran badly, and she went home exhausted and discouraged and sat with Garrick on the porch without enough words for what she felt. There were mornings she woke up at 4 with the specific dread of something she'd forgotten to organize. There were moments when the old voices found their way in, quieter than before but not gone, telling her it was luck. It wouldn't last. She was getting away with something that would eventually be corrected. On those mornings, she got up and went to the kitchen and lit the range and received the delivery and made the day's work real in front of her. And the voices fell back because they were only voices, and the work was actual. And there was no version of a voice that could uncount the receipts, or unbake the bread, or take back the name on the menu that belonged to Harriet Oakes, or the preserve jars lined up on the shelf that belonged to Margaret Hale, or the competent, unsentimental presence of Eleanor Marsh arriving 12 minutes early with her coat still on. It was built. It was real. Every person who had said she was too much of something or not enough of something else had said it to a version of her that had not yet done the work. And the work was now done, and it had no obligation to make peace with their predictions. Mabel Ashbourne stood in her kitchen while the range came to heat and the bread flour was measured and the delivery wagon sounded on the street outside. And she was, in the plain and unadorned meaning of the word, where she was supposed to be. Not because the story had been kind to her, not because it had gone smoothly or without cost, but because she had been willing, at every point where turning back would have been easier, to stay. And staying, showing up in the morning and doing the thing and being honest about the numbers and not running to Cheyenne when the easier offer was on the table, staying was not a passive thing. It was the most active choice available to a person. It was, in the end, the whole thing. The back door opened. Clara Voss arrived with cold on her coat and a question about the morning's bread schedule, and Eleanor answered her before Mabel had to, and the kitchen moved into its day, and outside on Crane Street, Harwick did the same. It was enough. It had always been enough.